Hey, take it. You don't have to thank me. Just eat. The billionaire said it softly, almost apologetically, as if he were intruding on something private, rather than standing in front of two children who hadn't eaten all day. Annie and her twin brother stopped at the same time. The paper bag hovered in the air between them, heavy, real, unmistakable. For a heartbeat, neither child moved. The world seemed to narrow to that bag and the man holding it. Eli's hands began to shake. He turned his head toward Annie, his voice barely audible. "Annie, can we?" Annie didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the man. He didn't look like anyone who belonged here. His coat was clean, his shoes unscuffed, his hands unmarked by work. He didn't smell like oil or sweat or rust the way everyone else near the factory did. He smelled like something distant, expensive, untouched. "We don't take things from strangers," Annie said at last. "I won't be a stranger for long," the man replied gently. "My name's David." "That's not enough," Annie said. David nodded, as if he had expected that. He slowly lowered the bag to the ground between them and took a step back. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to eat." Eli swallowed hard. His eyes never left the bag. "We can't pay," Annie said. "You don't need to. That's what everyone says before they want something." David exhaled. "I don't want anything from you. No favors, no pictures, no gratitude." Annie studied his face, searching for cracks. Adults always wanted something, even the nice ones. "Why?" she asked. David hesitated. The honest answer felt too heavy for a child, but lying felt worse. "Because I remember being hungry," he said, "and because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it." Annie frowned. "You?" "Yes." She looked him up and down again, unconvinced. "You don't look like someone who was ever hungry." David felt the words hit deeper than she knew. "I was," he said quietly. "A long time ago." Eli coughed. A sharp, hollow sound that cut through the tension. Annie instinctively reached back and steadied him with one hand. David noticed how small Eli was. Too thin, too tired. "Please," David said, lowering his voice. "Just eat." Annie clenched her jaw, then nodded once. "Okay," she said to Eli. But slow, I was bide. Eli knelt and pulled the bag toward him, his hands trembling as he opened it. His breath caught when he saw what was inside. "There's sandwiches," he whispered. "And apples." "Drink water first," Annie said automatically. David watched as Eli obeyed, his movements clumsy with hunger. Annie stayed standing, one foot slightly in front of her brother, never fully turning her back on David. "You still haven't told us who you really are," she said. David knew this moment was coming. "My full name is David Cole," he said. "I run Cole Development Group." Annie froze. The name settled into the space between them like a dropped plate. Eli stopped chewing. Annie's fingers curled into fists at her sides. Slowly, she lifted her head and stared at him, not as a child looking at an adult, but as someone connecting pieces that suddenly fit too well. "You're that David Cole?" she asked. David didn't correct her. "The one on the signs?" Eli asked quietly. Annie's voice came out steady, but her body had gone rigid. "The one on the news. The billionaire." David nodded once. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavier, sharper. Annie took a small step back, pulling Eli with her. "You're rich," Eli said, not accusing, just stating it. "Yes," David replied. Annie's eyes flicked to the direction of the steel factory, then back to him. "You own this place," she said. "I do." Her throat tightened. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. "You're the reason it shut down." David didn't answer immediately. Not because he couldn't, but because denying it would have been a lie. "Yes," he said. Eli's grip on the sandwich loosened. "That's when Dad stopped going to work," Annie continued. "That's when he got sick." David felt something inside him shift, like a beam giving way under too much weight. "That's when we started collecting cans," she finished. She gestured at the cart beside them, at the bag of food on the ground. "So now you come back," Annie said. "With food." Her eyes met his, sharp and unblinking. "Is this supposed to fix it?" David's mouth opened, then closed again. He had spoken in front of crowds. He had defended billion-dollar decisions. He had never felt this exposed. "No," he said finally. "It's not." Eli looked up at him, confusion and fear tangled together. "Are we in trouble?" the boy asked. "No," David said immediately. "You're not in trouble. None of this is your fault." Annie let out a short, bitter breath. "Everyone says that," she murmured. David knelt again, ignoring the ache in his knees. "I won't pretend I didn't play a part," he said. "And I won't pretend this food makes it right." Annie's eyes flickered, just for a second. "Then why are you here?" she asked. David looked at the two of them, at the food, at the factory looming behind them like a shadow that refused to move. "Because walking away once was already too much," he said. Annie didn't respond. She reached down, took an apple from the bag, and handed it to Eli. "Eat," she said quietly. Eli obeyed. David rose slowly, knowing something had already changed, though he couldn't yet name it. Standing there, in front of two children who had just learned exactly who he was, David Cole understood one thing with terrifying clarity. This was no longer an act of kindness. It was the beginning of reckoning. David didn't leave right away. He told himself that staying any longer would only make things worse, but his feet remained planted where they were, as if the cracked concrete beneath them had decided otherwise. Annie noticed. She noticed everything. "You can go now," she said. Not unkindly, just factual. "We'll finish eating." David nodded. "I know," but he didn't move. Eli sat on the curb with the bag between his knees, chewing carefully now, the first edge of desperation dulled by food. He took small sips of water like Annie had told him to. Annie stayed standing, eyes flicking between David and her brother, as if expecting something else to fall out of the sky now that the first impossible thing already had. "You don't have to watch," she said. "I'm not," David replied. "I just want to make sure he's okay." "He's been worse," Annie said. "This is a good day." The words shouldn't have hurt the way they did, but they lodged in David's chest all the same. "Where's your father?" he asked. Annie's shoulders stiffened. She didn't answer right away. Eli kept eating, gaze fixed on the sandwich like it might disappear if he looked away. "He's home," Annie said finally. "Resting. Is he sick?" Annie nodded once. From the factory, David felt the weight of that settle in his gut. "What kind of sick?" he asked gently. "Breathing," she said. "His chest hurts. Sometimes he can't get up." "Does he see a doctor?" She shook her head. "Doctors cost money." David had no response that wouldn't sound hollow. "Where is home?" he asked. Annie hesitated again, then jerked her chin toward a cluster of sagging buildings just beyond the factory's perimeter fence. "There." David followed her gaze. The place looked temporary in the way poverty often did structures meant to last a few years that ended up standing for decades. Peeling paint, windows patched with plastic, a silence that felt lived in, not peaceful. "I'd like to meet him," David said. Annie's head snapped back toward him. "Why?" "So I can help." She laughed once, sharp and short. "You already did. I mean really help. That's what everyone says," Annie replied. "Then they leave." "I'm not everyone." "I did." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You're the man who closed the factory," she said. "People like you don't stay." David didn't deny it. He couldn't. "Let me try," he said. Eli looked up then, his mouth full. "Annie," he murmured, unsure. Annie glanced down at him. She softened just a fraction. "Finish," she said. Then, to David, "1 minute. 80. She waited until Eli wiped his hands on his sleeves and drank the last of the water before she nodded toward the buildings. "Don't talk too much," she warned as they started walking. "He gets tired." David followed half a step behind, noticing the way Annie adjusted her pace to match her brother's, the way she angled her body to block him from passing cars that didn't slow down enough. She was 6 years old and already moving through the world like it would take something from them if she wasn't careful. They climbed the stairs to the second floor of a building that smelled of old metal and damp laundry. Annie knocked twice on a door with a dented frame. "Dad," she called. "It's me." The door opened slowly. The man who stood there looked older than David had expected, though he couldn't have been much past 50. His face was lined, his eyes sunken, his shoulders stooped in a way that suggested pain rather than age. He coughed into his fist before stepping aside. "Annie," he said. Then he noticed David. "Who's this?" "David," Annie said shortly. He brought food. The man's gaze flicked to the bag, then back to David, wary but polite. Thank you, he said. You didn't have to. I wanted to, David replied. The room was small. A couch with a blanket draped over it. A folding table, 3 mismatched chairs. The air felt heavy, like it had learned to hold its breath. Eli went straight to the couch and sat, suddenly exhausted. Annie hovered near him. You work at the factory? The man asked David. I did, David said carefully. I was involved. The man nodded slowly. We all were. One way or another. There was no accusation in his tone. That made it worse. I'm sorry, David said. The man waved a hand weakly. Sorry doesn't put food on the table. I wear. No, David agreed. But help might. The man studied him, then looked at Annie. You trust him? Annie didn't answer right away. She looked at David, then at her brother, then back at her father. I don't know, she said honestly. But he stayed. The man sighed and eased himself onto a chair. What do you want, Mr. David? He asked. David took a breath. I want to get you medical care, and I want to make sure your kids don't have to do this anymore. And then, the man pressed. David didn't rush his answer. Then I want to figure out what I owe you. Silence filled the room. Annie crossed her arms. You can't fix everything, she said. I know, David replied. But I can start. The man nodded slowly. That would be something. David stood to leave, feeling the weight of the place settle into him, imprinting itself somewhere he wouldn't be able to ignore later. I'll be back, he said. Annie didn't say thank you. She just watched him go, outside, as David walked back toward his car. The factory loomed again. Bigger now. Heavier. He realized something then, with a clarity that left no room for excuses. This land wasn't empty. It had never been. And for the first time since he'd signed the papers that shut it all down. David Cole understood that progress had a cost and it was standing behind him, watching to see if he would keep walking away. If this story made you pause and feel something real, take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling stories that matter where you are watching right now. David drove away from the steel factory slower than he had arrived. The city blurred past his windshield, but his mind stayed behind on the second-floor room. The stale air, the sound of a man coughing into his hand as if that might somehow contain the damage done to his lungs. He had seen sickness before. He had funded hospitals, donated to medical wings with his name etched into polished walls. None of that felt like it belonged to the same world as Annie and her family. At the first red light, David stopped and didn't move when it turned green. A horn blared behind him. He pressed the gas and continued on, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He hadn't lied when he said he would come back. But he also hadn't said when, or how, or with what authority. Promises were easy. He'd made a career out of words that sounded reassuring and cost him nothing in the moment. This one already felt expensive. By the time he reached his office downtown, dusk had settled in. The glass building rose clean and confident against the darkening sky. A monument to decisions that were framed as necessary, efficient, inevitable. His name sat on the top floor, embossed on a door that had never once resisted his entry. Inside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. David shrugged out of his coat and loosened his tie, then stood for a long moment in the center of the room, unsure what he was supposed to do next. There was no meeting scheduled for this, no agenda, no approved path forward. He pressed the intercom. Karen, he said, cancel my dinner. A pause. Everything? Yes. Another pause, longer this time. All right. David dropped into his chair and stared at the city below. Somewhere beyond the grid of lights, behind fences and forgotten zoning maps, Annie was probably making sure her brother didn't eat too fast. Somewhere a man who had given his body to molten steel was trying to sleep through pain without medication. David opened a file on his computer, then another, then another. Steel mill closure phase 3. He didn't remember opening it, but there it was. He scrolled. Dates. Projections. Risk assessments. Environmental impact statements. A clean, professional document that spoke in percentages and long-term benefits. No names, No faces, just numbers that had once convinced him this was the right move. He found his signature near the bottom. David leaned back and closed his eyes. "I didn't know," he murmured, though no one was there to hear it. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. He hadn't wanted to know. There was a difference, and it mattered. A knock came at the door. "Come in," David said. Mark Reynolds stepped inside, jacket still on, phone in hand. His head of development looked tired in the way men did when they'd spent the day managing problems instead of solving them. "You left the site early," Mark said. The survey team was asking. "I met some people," David interrupted. Mark blinked. "People? Families," David corrected. "Living behind the factory." Mark exhaled. "David, we went over this. That area's been flagged for relocation assistance." "Flagged," David repeated. "Has anyone actually been relocated?" Mark hesitated. "That takes time." "How much time?" "We're within compliance." David stood. "That wasn't my question." Mark shifted his weight. "Look, I get it. It's not pretty. But this is how redevelopment works. You can't stop progress because of kids picking through trash," David finished. Mark's jaw tightened. "This is bigger than that." "No," David said quietly. "It isn't." Mark stared at him. "Are you serious right now?" David walked to the window and looked out again. "I want a list," he said. "Everyone laid off from the steel mill. Names, medical conditions, insurance status. That's going to raise questions." "Let them." Mark hesitated. "And then what?" David turned. "Then we start fixing what we broke." Mark shook his head slowly. "This is not what we agreed on." "I know," David said. "That's the problem." After Mark left, David sat alone again. The city hummed beneath him. Indifferent. He thought of Annie's eyes when she'd realized who he was. Not angry, not pleading, just clear. "You're already part of it." His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He ignored it. It buzzed again. David answered. "David Cole." A woman's voice came through, calm and professional. "Mr. Cole, this is Street Mary's community clinic. We're calling about a patient named Robert Johnson." David's breath caught. "Annie's father." "Yes," he said quickly. "I know him. He was brought in earlier this evening," the woman continued. "Severe respiratory distress. He listed no insurance. We were told you might be assisting the family." David stood so fast his chair tipped backward. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I am." There was a pause. "Then we need you to make some decisions. Do whatever you need to do," David said without hesitation. "I'll cover it." Silence again, heavier this time. "Sir," the woman said carefully, "this won't be inexpensive." David closed his eyes. "I know," he replied. "I'll be there." Irisy. When he hung up, the office felt suddenly too small. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, not bothering to call a driver. He took the stairs instead of the elevator, his footsteps echoing, grounding him in a way the quiet luxury never had. At a red light near the hospital, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked the same as he had that morning. Same face, same suit, same man, but something behind his eyes had shifted. At the hospital, the waiting room was nearly empty. Annie sat in a plastic chair, her feet not quite touching the floor, Eli asleep against her shoulder. She looked up when David entered. "You came," she said. "I said I would." She nodded, then looked back at her brother. "They're helping Dad," she said. "But they asked about money." David crouched in front of her, lowering himself again to her level. "That's my part," he said. "Yours is just to be a kid." Annie watched him closely. "You can still leave," she said. "People like you always can." David met her gaze. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm staying." Annie didn't smile. She didn't thank him, but she didn't look away either. And for David Cole, that felt like the first real test he had passed in a very long time. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and stale air, a sharp contrast to the rust and dust that clung to everything near the steel factory. David noticed it immediately. Annie did too. She wrinkled her nose, then straightened her back as if reminding herself where she was and what was expected of her. Robert Johnson lay in the bed with an oxygen mask fitted over his face, the soft hiss of the machine filling the room. His eyes were half open, unfocused. But when Annie stepped closer, they sharpened just enough to recognize her. "Hey, sweetheart," he rasped. "I'm here," Annie said quickly, moving to his side. She reached up and carefully adjusted the blanket the way she always did, smoothing it flat. "Eli's sleeping." He ate. Robert's gaze flicked past her, landing on David for the first time. "And who's this?" he asked, his voice thin but steady. David stepped forward. "David Cole. We met earlier." "Well, present." Robert studied him for a long moment, then gave a faint nod. "You brought the food." "Yes, sir." Robert's mouth twitched. "That was decent of you." David didn't reply. Decent felt like a word that belonged to another version of himself. A nurse entered quietly, checked the monitors, then looked at David. "Mr. Cole, the doctor will be back shortly. We've stabilized him for now, but this isn't something we can patch up and send him home from." Was nodding and dest. "What does that mean?" Annie asked, her voice tight. The nurse softened her tone. "It means your dad needs treatment. Real treatment. And rest." Annie nodded as if she already knew that. She always did. "I'll make sure he gets it," David said. The nurse hesitated. "You understand the costs involved?" "I do," David replied. "And I'll handle them." The nurse gave a small, approving nod and left the room. Annie turned slowly toward David. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." She frowned. "Then why are you?" David looked at Robert, then back at Annie. "Because this shouldn't be your problem to solve." Annie crossed her arms. "It always is." Robert shifted slightly, wincing. "Annie," he said. "Enough." She relaxed a fraction, then sat down in the chair beside the bed. David remained standing, unsure where he belonged in the room. "So," Robert said after a moment, his gaze steady on David. "You're the man with the plans." David nodded. "Yes, IB40s. The factory," Robert continued. "I gave it 30 years. I know." Robert's brow furrowed. "Do you?" David didn't rush his answer. "Not the way you do. But I know I signed off on shutting it down." Silence followed. Not angry silence. Tired silence. "I used to bring my kids there on family day," Robert said. "Show them where I worked. Told them that steel built this city." Annie looked at him, surprised. "You never told me that." Robert smiled faintly. "Didn't think it mattered anymore." "It matters," David said. Robert glanced at him. "Does it?" David felt the question settle deep. "It does to me." Robert studied his face. "Why?" David thought of the files, the signatures, the cart full of cans. "Because I forgot that progress doesn't erase people," he said. Annie watched him closely, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You didn't forget," she said. "You just didn't look." The words stung because they were true. David nodded once. "You're right." Robert exhaled slowly. "Most men wouldn't say that." "Most men haven't been corrected by a 6-year-old, David replied. Annie didn't smile, but something in her shoulders loosened. The doctor arrived then, explaining test results in careful terms. Chronic exposure, inflammation, damage that had been building for years. Treatable, but not quickly. "We'll need to keep him here for a while," the doctor said. "And then long-term care." "I'll arrange it," David said. The doctor nodded. "All right." When the doctor left, Robert closed his eyes, exhausted. "You should go home," Annie told him softly. "I will," Robert murmured. "Just rest." Annie stood and took Eli's hand when David motioned toward the waiting area. Outside the room, the hallway lights hummed softly. Eli leaned against Annie, half asleep. "Is Dad going to be okay?" he asked. "He is now," David said. Eli nodded, trusting without question, then drifted off. Annie watched David carefully as he settled Eli into a chair. "You're doing a lot," she said. "I should have done more sooner." "That doesn't help," she replied. "I know." She considered him. "People will be mad." "They already are," David said. "They just don't know it yet." Annie frowned. "What do you mean?" David leaned back against the wall. "Helping your dad is easy. Fixing what led here isn't." Annie hugged herself. "Does that mean the factory stays closed?" "Yes." And the houses?" David hesitated. "That depends on what I do next." She nodded slowly. "You're scared." He smiled faintly. Is it that obvious? You keep answering like you're choosing your words, she said. That's what scared people do. David let out a breath. You're very perceptive. I had to be. They sat in silence for a while, the hospital around them moving on without notice. Finally, Annie spoke again. You can still stop, she said. You can pay for Dad and leave. Aftering the bitter, David looked at her. Would you let me? She met his gaze. No, he nodded. Then neither will I. Annie didn't say anything after that. She just sat there, watching him, measuring not his words this time, but whether he stayed. And David Cole did. Morning came quietly, without ceremony. The hospital windows let in a pale, washed-out light that made everything look softer than it really was. David noticed it first when he stirred in the chair he hadn't meant to fall asleep in. His neck ached, his jacket was folded awkwardly over the armrest, and his phone lay dark in his hand, untouched. No missed calls. No urgent messages. For the first time in years, the world hadn't demanded anything from him overnight. Across the room, Annie was awake. She sat upright in her chair, feet dangling, her back straight in a way that suggested she'd been awake for a while. Eli was curled up against her side, breathing evenly, his mouth slightly open. Annie's hand rested on his shoulder, rising and falling with each breath, as if she were counting them. You didn't leave, she said quietly. David looked at her. Neither did you, she shrugged. Someone had to listen. Oh, to what? In case Dad needed something, she replied. He doesn't like the button. David nodded. I don't either. Annie studied him for a moment. You snore a little, she added. David let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. Good to know. A nurse entered the room, checking charts, adjusting IV lines. She glanced at David, then at Annie. He had a stable night, she said. That's a good sign. Annie's shoulders relaxed just enough to notice. When can he go home? She asked. The nurse hesitated. Not soon. He needs monitoring. Oxygen. Medication. Annie nodded, absorbing the words. Okay. After the nurse left, Annie swung her legs slightly, staring at the floor. Home isn't really home anyway, she said. David leaned forward. What do you mean? Our building, she replied. They put notices on the doors last week. Red ones. David felt his stomach tighten. Eviction notices? She nodded. They say we have 30 days. Dad said not to worry. And what did you think? David asked. Annie's mouth pressed into a thin line. That he was lying. David closed his eyes briefly. I didn't know, he said. I know, Annie replied. That's what everyone says. There was no anger in her voice, just a quiet, practiced acceptance that made the words heavier. David stood and walked to the window. Below them, cars moved steadily, people heading to work, to breakfast, to lives that assumed stability as a given. He wondered how many of them knew what stood on the land they passed every day. How many remembered what it had cost to clear it. I'm making some calls today, he said. Annie looked up. About what? About housing, David replied. Temporary, at least. And about the notices. She tilted her head. You can do that? Yes. Because you're rich. Eli mumbled suddenly, half awake. David turned. Because I have influence. He corrected gently. Eli squinted at him. That's the same thing. I mine. Annie smoothed Eli's hair. Go back to sleep. Eli complied, drifting off again. Annie looked back at David. You keep saying you'll fix things. I know. And you keep staying. Yes, she thought about that. Most people do one or the other. David nodded. That's fair. A few hours later, David stepped out into the hallway to make his calls. He kept his voice low, his tone firm. He spoke to a hospital administrator, a housing liaison, a legal advisor who sounded surprised to hear from him so early. I need options, David said, not explanations. When he returned, Annie was sitting alone. Eli was gone. Where's your brother? David asked, alarmed. Down the hall, Annie said. The volunteer lady took him to get pancakes. David blinked. Pancakes? She said kids shouldn't miss breakfast, Annie replied. I told her he's picky. David smiled faintly. Is he? He likes them plain, Annie said. No syrup. 22. David absorbed that, the way he was starting to absorb details that mattered. Did you eat? He asked. She shook her head. Later. Annie, he said gently. She said, fine. He went to the vending machine and returned with a granola bar and juice. Annie accepted them without comment. As she ate, she asked, What happens to you now? David considered the question. What do you mean? You came here for work, she said. Now you're here for us. Yes. She took another bite. Do you get in trouble for that? David smiled without humor. Sometimes, Annie nodded. My dad used to say, doing the right thing costs more than doing nothing. He's a wise man, David replied. She looked toward the door of her father's room. He didn't plan on getting sick. No one does. He didn't plan on losing his job either. David swallowed. I know. There was a knock at the door. A man in a suit stepped in, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Cole, he said, I'm from the housing office. You asked to see me. David stood. Yes, thank you for coming. The man glanced at Annie, then back at David. We can discuss. She's part of this, David interrupted. Annie stiffened slightly but didn't speak. The man nodded. All right. The building your family lives in is scheduled for clearance. It's part of the redevelopment zone. David folded his arms. And relocation? There are shelters, the man said. Waitlists. In declare. That's not acceptable, David replied. The man hesitated. Sir, the plan has already been approved. David met his gaze. Plans can change. Annie watched, eyes wide but steady. What do you want to do? The man asked. David didn't answer right away. He looked at Annie. What do you want? He asked her instead. She hesitated. I want my dad to get better, she said. I want Eli to sleep in a bed. And I want to go to school. David turned back to the man. Make it happen. The man blinked. That's a lot. Yes, David said. It is. After the man left, Annie stared at David. You didn't have to do that, she said again. David sat down across from her. I know. Why do you keep saying that? Because I want you to know this isn't a favor, he replied. It's a responsibility. Annie considered that. You sound like my dad. David smiled softly. I'll take that as a compliment. A nurse appeared with Eli, syrup-free pancakes in hand. Eli grinned when he saw David. They're good, he announced. I'm glad, David said. Annie watched the two of them, then looked back at David. You're not leaving today, are you? She asked. David shook his head. No. She nodded once, as if confirming something for herself. Outside the room, the city kept moving. Inside, something slower and heavier was taking shape. Not a solution. Not yet, but a beginning. The temporary housing unit was quieter than David expected. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't meant to be. But it was clean, warm, and solid, in a way Annie immediately noticed. She tested the floor with her foot when they walked in, as if expecting it to give way. It didn't. Eli ran ahead, then stopped, unsure whether he was allowed to be excited. This is ours? Annie asked. For now, David said. Until your dad gets stronger and we figure out the next step. Annie nodded slowly. She walked through each room with care, touching the wall, the table, the edge of the bed. She opened the refrigerator and stared at the empty shelves. There's nothing in here, Eli said, disappointed. Yet, David replied. He stepped outside to take a call while Annie sat on the bed, hands folded in her lap. Through the thin wall, she could hear his voice, low and firm, the way grown-ups sounded when they meant what they said. Yes. Today. No. That won't work. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. She had heard that tone before on television, on radios in other people's apartments, but never directed at something that affected her life. Eli hopped onto the bed beside her. Do you think he's really going to stay? Annie didn't answer right away. I don't know, she said finally. But he hasn't left yet. That mattered more than she wanted to admit. When David came back in, he was carrying keys. There'll be groceries delivered tonight, he said, and some clothes. School supplies too. Annie's head snapped up. School? Yes. She frowned. I've never been. I know. She crossed her arms. I'm not dumb. David met her gaze. I don't think you are. But teachers don't like kids who don't know things, she said. They get mad. David crouched in front of her. Good teachers don't. And the others? Then we find better ones. Annie studied his face. You say things like you can just change them. Some things, David said carefully. Not everything. She nodded, accepting that answer. That evening, David drove back to the hospital alone. He hadn't told Annie where he was going. She didn't ask. She had already learned that adults sometimes needed to move pieces around before explaining them. Robert Johnson was awake when David arrived, sitting upright with a breathing tube still in place. Eyes clearer than before. They moved the kids? Robert asked. Yes, David replied. Temporary housing. End quote. Robert closed his eyes briefly. Good. I'm not doing this to buy forgiveness, David said. Robert opened his eyes again. Then don't. David took a seat. I want to talk about the factory. Robert's jaw tightened. I figured. I didn't plan for what happened to you, David said. But I signed off on decisions that made it possible. Robert studied him. You want me to yell? No, David replied. I want you to tell me what it took. Robert looked at the ceiling for a long moment. It took my lungs. It took my pride. It took my kids' childhood. David absorbed that in silence. People like you don't usually ask, Robert continued. They send checks. I've sent checks, David said. And did they fix it? David shook his head. Robert exhaled slowly. Then you're already ahead of most. When David left the hospital, it was dark. The city lights reflected off the windshield like distant fires. He drove without music, without calls, replaying the words in his mind. It took my kids' childhood. Back at the housing unit, the delivery had arrived. Bags lined the kitchen counter. Annie stood on a chair, putting canned goods away with careful precision. Eli was on the floor, surrounded by school notebooks, drawing uneven shapes with a pencil. You draw? David asked. Eli nodded proudly. Mostly trucks. Why trucks? They move things, Eli said. Important things. David smiled. Annie climbed down from the chair. The lady said school starts in 2 weeks. That's right, David said. She hesitated. What if Dad can't come home by then? David didn't rush his answer. Then we adjust. Annie frowned. You keep saying that, because it's true. She looked at him, searching again. Are you tired? Yes. Then why don't you leave? David paused. The answer came without calculation. Because if I do, this all becomes temporary in the worst way. Annie nodded slowly. Okay, Eliezer. That night, after Eli fell asleep on the couch with a notebook still in his hand, Annie sat beside David at the small kitchen table. People will get mad at you, she said. They already are, David replied. They'll say you're helping us to look good. Some will. And what if they're right? David considered that. Then I'll have to live with that, he said. But I won't let that stop me from doing what's right. Annie stared at the table. My dad says sometimes people do the right thing for the wrong reasons. David nodded. And sometimes they start for the wrong reasons and end up changing. She looked up. Are you changing? David met her gaze. I hope so. Annie leaned back in her chair, processing that. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. Somewhere, paperwork was being filed. Plans were being reviewed. Systems were continuing as they always had. But inside the small, temporary apartment, something quieter was happening. A child was beginning to believe that staying might be possible. A man was beginning to understand that staying meant more than showing up, and neither of them knew yet how much that choice was going to cost. The first protest formed quietly. David only learned about it because Karen called him just after sunrise, her voice tighter than usual. There are people gathering near the old factory site, she said. Former workers. Families. David paused at the kitchen counter of the temporary apartment, coffee untouched. Annie sat at the table, tying and retying the same shoelace, practicing for school. Eli was still asleep on the couch. Are they blocking access? David asked. Not yet, Karen replied. But the media's on their way. David looked at Annie. She wasn't listening, but she was always listening. "I'll be there," he said. When he hung up, Annie looked up. "You're going back there," she said. "Yes." She nodded once. "They're angry. They have a right to be." She considered that. "Are you going to tell them about us?" David hesitated. "No." "Why?" "Because this isn't about me helping 2 kids," he said. "It's about everyone they forgot." Was Reset. Annie studied his face. "You're scared again." "Yes," David said honestly. "But not of them." He left quietly, returning to a place that now felt different. The factory gates were lined with people holding handmade signs. Some recognized him immediately, others didn't until the murmurs spread. "That's him, the billionaire, the one who shut us down." David didn't bring security. He walked forward alone. Voices rose. Anger sharpened the air. A man stepped forward. Older, broad-shouldered, his hands scarred with work. "You got a lot of nerve showing up." David met his gaze. "I know. You took our jobs," another voice shouted. "Our insurance." David nodded. "Yes, that stopped them." Not the answer they expected. "I didn't come to defend what I did," David said. "I came to listen." A woman laughed bitterly. "Now you want to listen?" "Yes." Silence followed. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, but attention. One by one, they spoke. About illnesses, evictions, marriages strained to breaking, children pulled from school. David stood there and took it all. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explain. When it ended, no one applauded. No one thanked him, but no one shouted either. That afternoon, David made decisions that would ripple outward. Funding was redirected. Timelines frozen. Independent reviews ordered. Temporary jobs created for cleanup and safety work. It wasn't enough. He knew that, but it was something. Back at the apartment, Annie waited by the window. "You didn't get arrested," she observed. "Not today," David said. "Did they yell?" "Yes." "Did you yell back?" "No." She nodded, satisfied. That night, David received his first warning call from the board. "You're overstepping," a voice said. "This isn't charity, it's accountability," David replied. "Be careful," the voice warned. "You're making enemies." David thought of Annie, of Eli asleep with a pencil still in his hand, of Robert Johnson breathing through a machine because no one had been careful before. "I already have," David said, and ended the call. Later, Annie spoke softly from the doorway. "My dad used to say the loudest people aren't always the strongest." David smiled faintly. "Your dad says a lot of wise things." She stepped closer. "He also said men don't change unless something breaks." David looked at her. "What do you think broke?" Annie shrugged. "Maybe you." He didn't argue. Outside, the city carried on. Inside, a fragile trust was forming, tested by every choice, every consequence. David knew now that staying meant more than fixing mistakes. It meant standing in the middle of anger and not turning away. And somewhere deep inside, he understood that this was only the beginning. The backlash didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, emails forwarded with no subject lines, board members suddenly unavailable, a quiet shift in tone when David walked into rooms he used to control without effort. He noticed it in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way conversations stopped when he entered, then resumed carefully, like stepping around broken glass. Annie noticed it too. "You're quieter," she said one evening as they sat at the small kitchen table. Eli was on the floor, lining up toy cars he'd been given by a volunteer from the clinic. "I'm thinking," David replied. "That's what Dad says when he's worried," Annie said. David smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I am." Robert Johnson was still in the hospital. The doctors were cautious, optimistic in measured ways. Progress was possible, but only if nothing else went wrong. David visited every morning before work and every night after. He didn't announce himself. He just came. One morning, Robert looked at him and said, "They don't like this." David didn't pretend not to understand. "No." "You going to stop?" "No." Robert nodded slowly. "Then it's going to cost you." "Yes." Robert closed his eyes. "Good." David took that with him as he walked out into the day. At the apartment, Annie was learning how to read a clock. She frowned at the numbers, lips moving silently as she counted. "Why is it like this?" she asked. "Why not just numbers in order?" David leaned against the counter. "Because someone decided this way was better." "Is it?" "Not always," he admitted. She looked up. "Then why don't they change it?" "Because changing things means admitting the old way wasn't perfect." Annie considered that. "Adults don't like that." "No," David said. "They really don't." That afternoon, David was called into an emergency board meeting. The room was full, too full, faces tight with irritation disguised as concern. "This is not what you were hired to do," one man said. "I wasn't hired," David replied calmly. "I built this. That doesn't give you the right to jeopardize it," another voice snapped. David folded his hands on the table. "It gives me the responsibility," a woman leaned forward. "You're diverting funds, delaying projects, talking to the press without clearance." "I'm addressing harm," David said. "You're creating liability," she countered. David met her gaze. "That liability already existed." Silence followed. Then the oldest member of the board spoke. "You're letting this get personal," he said. David didn't deny it. It always was. The meeting ended without resolution. Which, David knew, was a warning. That night, Annie waited up. "They're mad," she said when he walked in. "Yes, they might fire you." "They can't," David replied. "But they can make things difficult." Was very 14. She tilted her head. "Why are you still doing it?" David set his keys down carefully. "Because walking away would be easier. And easier doesn't fix anything." Annie thought about that. "My dad says easy choices don't make you proud." David nodded. "He's right." Later, when Eli was asleep, Annie sat on the couch beside David. "If you lose your job," she said, "do you lose everything?" David considered the question. "I lose power," he said. "Not everything. She hugged a pillow to her chest. "We don't have power." David looked at her. "You have more than you think." She frowned. "Like what?" "You tell the truth," he said. "Even when it's uncomfortable. That's power." Annie absorbed that quietly. The next day, the notice came. A formal letter. Polite language. Serious implications. The board was initiating a review of David's leadership. Temporary restrictions. Oversight. David read it once, then again. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. At the hospital, Robert noticed immediately. "That bad?" he asked. "It's starting," David replied. Robert nodded. "Good men don't get punished for nothing." David smiled. "You have a way with words. Comes from being ignored long enough," Robert said. That evening, David didn't hide the letter from Annie. She read it slowly, lips moving as she decoded the words. "They're trying to stop you," she said. "Yes. Okay. Because of us?" "Because of what we represent," David replied. "We make things inconvenient." Annie looked up sharply. "I don't want to be a problem." David knelt in front of her. "You're not. But you're getting hurt," she insisted. David met her gaze. "I've been protected my whole life. This isn't hurt. This is balance." She stared at him, eyes shining with something close to fear. "What if they win?" she asked. David didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady. "Then I keep going anyway." Annie searched his face, then nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. Outside, the city hummed. Somewhere, decisions were being made about land and money and timelines. Inside the apartment, a different kind of decision had already been made. David wasn't leaving, and Annie, for the first time, allowed herself to believe that maybe this time, neither would he. The school smelled like floor cleaner and paper. Annie noticed it the moment she stepped inside, her hand tight around Eli's. The hallway was louder than she expected, voices bouncing off lockers, shoes squeaking, laughter sharp and sudden. She straightened her shoulders, the way she did when she was bracing for something. "You don't have to hold my hand," Eli said, embarrassed. "Yes, I do," Annie replied. "You get lost." "I don't." "You do," she said, without looking at him. David followed a few steps behind, deliberately quiet. He had offered to wait outside. Annie had said no. "If you leave," she'd told him, I won't know where to stand. So he stayed. The secretary smiled at them, practiced and polite. You must be Annie and Eli. Annie nodded. Eli hid behind her leg. I'm Miss Turner, the woman continued. We're glad you're here. Annie wasn't sure that was true, but she nodded again. They were given schedules, lockers, laminated cards with names spelled correctly. Annie traced her finger over the letters of her own name as if confirming it belonged to her. You'll start with assessment today, Miss Turner said gently. Just to see where you're at. I know things, Annie said quickly. I believe you, the woman replied. This is just to help us help you. Annie glanced back at David. He met her eyes and nodded once. You've got this, he said. She hesitated, then released Eli's hand. Don't talk to strangers, she told him sternly. Eli rolled his eyes. You're not my mom. I know, Annie said. I'm worse. David watched them disappear down opposite halls, a strange tightness settling in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to rely on the small rituals, Annie's instructions, Eli's questions. Without them, the building felt too big. Outside, his phone buzzed. The board. He didn't answer. At the hospital, Robert was sitting up without the mask for the first time. Look at you, David said, trying not to sound too hopeful. Don't get excited, Robert replied. They say it's temporary. Temporary is still better than yesterday. Robert studied him. You look tired. I am. Good, Robert said. Means you're doing something. David smiled faintly. They started school today, he said. Robert's eyes softened. About time. They're scared, David added. They'll be all right, Robert said. Annie's stronger than she looks. I know. There was a pause. You still going to lose your job? Robert asked. Maybe. Robert nodded. Jobs come and go. David glanced at him. Families don't. Robert met his gaze. Exactly. That afternoon, David finally answered the board's call. We're calling a vote, the chair said. Effective immediately. On what? David asked. On your leadership. David closed his eyes briefly. Understood. W. When he picked the kids up from school, Annie was quiet. Eli, on the other hand, was buzzing. They have books, he announced. And crayons. And a lunchroom. Yes, Annie said. Schools do. I got pancakes again, Eli added. Annie shot David a look. He's going to expect that now. David smiled. That's on me. In the car, Annie stared out the window. Did I do bad? She asked suddenly. No. David said immediately. Why would you think that? They asked me to read, she said. I was slow. David considered his words carefully. Being slow doesn't mean being wrong, he said. It means being careful. She nodded, absorbing that. They said I'm behind, she added. David tightened his grip on the wheel. Behind what? Other kids, she said. They said I can catch up. You will, David replied. She glanced at him. Promise? I don't promise things I can't keep, he said. But I believe you will. That seemed to satisfy her. That night, after Eli fell asleep with a school book open on his chest, Annie sat at the table doing homework she hadn't been assigned, copying letters over and over. You don't have to do that, David said. I want to, she replied. I don't want them to think I don't belong. David sat across from her. Annie, he said gently. You belong anywhere you decide to stand. She looked up. Even if people don't want me there? Especially then, he said. She thought about that, then went back to writing. Later, David's phone buzzed again. The board's decision came in a single sentence. Effective immediately. He read it once. Then he set the phone down. Annie noticed. What happened? She asked. David didn't sugarcoat it. They voted me out. She stared at him. Because of us? Because of choices, he replied. Some of them about you. Most of them about what you showed me. Eli stirred on the couch. Did you lose your job? Yes, David said. Eli frowned. Is that bad? David considered the question. It's different, he said. But not bad. Annie's eyes filled, just a little. You said you wouldn't leave. I won't, David said firmly. This doesn't change that, but you don't have to stay now, she whispered. David leaned forward. I didn't have to stay before either. She watched him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, she said quietly. Outside, the city lights flickered on. Somewhere, another meeting was ending. Another decision was being justified. Inside the small apartment, a different future was taking shape, uncertain, harder, and more honest than the one David had lost. And for the first time since he'd signed away the factory, David Cole felt something close to peace. The morning after David lost his job did not feel dramatic. There were no reporters outside the apartment. No angry calls before sunrise. The world did not pause to acknowledge the shift that had taken place. Annie noticed that first. It's quiet, she said, standing by the window with her backpack already on. David poured coffee into a chipped mug he hadn't noticed before. It usually is, he replied. Big changes don't announce themselves. Eli yawned from the couch. Do we still go to school? Yes, David said immediately. Even if you don't work? Especially then. Annie watched him closely, as if testing the truth of that answer. You're not wearing a suit, David looked down at himself. Jeans, a plain jacket, no tie. I guess I don't have to anymore. She considered that. You look normal, he smiled. Careful. That might be my favorite compliment. At school drop-off, Annie didn't hesitate this time. She walked ahead, Eli trailing just behind her, his head turned back long enough to wave. David waved back, feeling the strange weight of time suddenly unstructured. No office to go to, no board to answer to. For the first time in decades, he had nowhere he was expected to be. He drove to the hospital instead. Robert was sitting up, eating oatmeal slowly, methodically. They tell you yet? Robert asked without looking up. Yes, David replied. It's official. Robert nodded. Figured. Might. David sat down. You don't seem surprised. Robert shrugged. Men who shake things don't get invited to keep the table steady. David exhaled. I don't regret it. Good, Robert said. Regret's a useless thing when it comes too late. David studied him. How are you feeling? Like someone finally turned the volume down, Robert replied. Still hurts. But I can hear myself think. David nodded. They're talking about discharge next week. Robert's spoon paused. Where do I go? David didn't hesitate. Home. A real one. Robert looked up then. You sure? Yes. Robert studied his face. You lose your job and decide to take in a sick man? David smiled faintly. I gained some clarity. That afternoon, David walked through the old factory site alone. The gates were locked now. Signs posted. The place looked abandoned in the way things did when people left, but consequences stayed behind. He stood where Annie and Eli had collected cans, where he'd first offered food with a hand that hadn't yet learned to tremble. He remembered the first time he'd picked through trash as a boy. How shame and hunger had wrestled inside him until hunger won. How someone he couldn't even remember her face had handed him a sandwich without asking his name. He had become very good at forgetting that version of himself. Not again, he murmured. The sound of footsteps pulled him back. A woman stood a few yards away, camera hanging at her side. Not filming. Just watching. Mr. Cole? She asked. Yes. I'm not here for a quote, she said quickly. I just wanted to see if it was true. What? David asked. That you lost everything and stayed anyway. David considered the phrasing. I didn't lose everything. She tilted her head. Most people would say you did. David looked back at the factory. Most people measure the wrong things. She nodded slowly, as if filing that away. Thank you. For what? For not pretending this place was empty, she said. She walked away before he could answer. That evening, Annie came home quieter than usual. How was school? David asked. She set her backpack down carefully. Better. Better how? My teacher asked me to read again, she said. I was still slow. But I didn't stop. David smiled. That's progress. She hesitated. She said, I ask good questions. You do. The rehabit. Annie looked up. She said that means I'm thinking. David nodded. She's right. Eli burst in from the hallway. We learned about maps. Yes, David said. They show where things are, Eli explained seriously. Even if you don't know the place yet. David crouched. That's a good way to think about it. Later, as Annie worked through her homework, she glanced at David. "You're not going back, are you?" she asked. "No," David replied. "Not to that." She nodded. "Okay. 2. You're not scared?" he asked. She considered it. "A little. But I was scared before too." David leaned back. "And now?" "Now it's different," she said. "Before, nobody chose us. Now someone is." David swallowed. That night, as the apartment settled into sleep, David sat alone at the table. Papers spread out. Not contracts, not projections. Lists, names, ideas. He was sketching something new, not a company, not yet, but a way forward that didn't require him to look away. He wrote one sentence at the top of the page and underlined it. "Progress that leaves people behind is just another kind of loss." In the other room, Annie shifted in her sleep. Eli murmured something about trucks. David listened until their breathing evened out again. He didn't know what tomorrow would demand. He didn't know how long the money would last or how loud the opposition would get. But he knew this. Walking away had been the easy choice once. He wasn't making it again. The foundation began as a single sheet of paper taped to the refrigerator. Annie noticed it first. She stood on her toes to read the words written in David's neat, deliberate handwriting. "What's Cole Community Trust?" she asked. David looked up from the kitchen table, where he was sorting through folders that no longer belonged to any company. "It's an idea," he said. "One that might turn into something real." Like a job?" Eli asked from the couch, his legs dangling upside down over the armrest. "Like a responsibility," David replied. Annie squinted at the paper. "It says healthcare, housing, legal help." "Yes. For people like us?" she asked. David didn't hesitate. "For people who were never supposed to be invisible." She stared at the page for a long moment. "You're serious?" "Yes. You're really not going back," she said. "No." Annie nodded once. "Okay, That word carried more weight than any contract David had ever signed. Robert came home 3 days later. David was there when the transport van pulled up, holding the door open while Annie hovered anxiously on the sidewalk. Eli bounced from foot to foot, too excited to stay still. When Robert stepped out, thinner and slower but standing on his own, Annie froze. "You're really here," she said. Robert smiled tiredly. "Looks like it." She stepped forward and hugged him carefully, the way children do when they know something is fragile. Eli followed, wrapping his arms around Robert's waist without hesitation. David stood back, watching, his chest tight. Inside, Robert took in the apartment, the clean couch, the stocked kitchen, the school backpacks by the door. "You did all this," he said quietly. David shook his head. "We did." Robert looked at him then, really looked. "You lost everything for this." Fine." David met his gaze. "No. I gave something up." Robert exhaled slowly. "That's not how most men see it. That's why most men don't change," David replied. The weeks that followed were heavy with work. David spent his days on the phone, in borrowed office space, meeting with people who had never been invited into glass buildings before. Lawyers who knew eviction law, nurses who had worked clinics on shoestring budgets, former steelworkers who knew exactly what their community needed and had never been asked. The foundation grew slowly, unevenly, like something alive. Annie noticed the difference in him. "You don't sit still anymore," she said one night as he paced the living room, phone pressed to his ear. "I'm learning," David replied. "About what?" "About listening before deciding." She nodded. "That's new." "Yes," David admitted. "It is." At school, Annie began to change too. She still read slowly, but she raised her hand more often. She asked questions that made her teacher pause. When another student laughed at her once for stumbling over a word, Annie didn't shrink. "I'm learning," she said simply. "What's your excuse?" When David heard about it later, he didn't praise her. He just said, "I'm proud of you." That was enough. Eli flourished in quieter ways. He drew maps of places he'd never been. He asked Robert endless questions about machines and how things fit together. Robert answered patiently, grateful for something solid to hold on to while his strength returned. One evening, a letter arrived. Not an email. Not a call. A letter. Heavy paper. Careful language. David read it at the table while Annie did homework nearby. "What is it?" she asked. "The board," David replied. "They want you back?" Eli asked hopefully. David shook his head. "They want distance. I kenned en fruzide." Annie leaned over to read the page. "They say you damaged the company's reputation." David smiled faintly. "That may be true. And this," she continued. "They say your foundation is misguided." "Yes." Annie straightened. "Is it?" David looked at her. "Do you think it is?" She thought for a moment. "No. Then it isn't." She nodded, satisfied. Later that night, David sat alone on the small balcony, city lights flickering below. He thought about the life he'd built and the one he was building now. One had been faster, cleaner, applauded. This one felt heavier, truer. Robert joined him quietly, lowering himself into a chair. "They still mad?" Robert asked. "Yes." "Good," Robert said. "Means you hit something important." David chuckled softly. "You're getting comfortable with this." Robert smiled. "I spent my life being told to keep my head down. Turns out, it hurts your neck." They sat in silence for a while. "You know," Robert said eventually, "Annie asked me something today." "What?" "She asked if you were her family." David's breath caught. "What did you say?" Robert looked at him. "I said family isn't about blood. It's about who stays." David swallowed. "And what did she say?" She said. Then yes, the city hummed below them, indifferent and vast. Inside, Annie slept with a book open on her chest. Eli murmured softly in his dreams. The apartment was still temporary on paper, still fragile in the eyes of the world, but something permanent had taken root there. David leaned back, eyes on the night sky. He had lost a title, a company, a carefully curated life. In their place, he had gained something far more dangerous and far more valuable. A reason. The first threat arrived by mail. It was slipped through the slot in the apartment door sometime between midnight and dawn. Folded once, no return address. David found it when he went to collect the newspaper. He didn't open it right away. He already knew what it was before he read the words. "You don't get to rewrite history. Walk away while you still can." David stood there for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. Not from fear, at least not the kind he used to know, but from recognition. This was the cost Robert had warned him about. This was the sound of something pushing back. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. Inside, Annie was at the table, cereal untouched, staring at her math worksheet like it had personally offended her. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. David poured himself coffee. "Show me." She slid the paper across. "They say there's only one right answer, but they don't explain why." David smiled faintly. "That happens a lot." She looked up. "In school or in life?" "Yes," he replied. She studied him for a second. "Something's wrong." David hesitated. "Why do you think that?" "You didn't say good morning," she said. "And you're holding your pocket like you do when you forget your keys." He exhaled. "Someone sent a letter." Her posture changed immediately. "A bad one." "Yes. About the foundation?" "About me," David said. "About not staying where I am." Annie's jaw tightened. "Are they going to make you stop?" David met her eyes. "No." She searched his face. "Promise?" David shook his head. "I don't promise things I can't control. But I won't walk away." That seemed to settle something in her. At the hospital, Robert listened quietly as David told him about the letter. "Took them long enough," Robert said. "You're not concerned?" David asked. Robert shrugged. "Men who benefit from silence don't like noise." David leaned against the wall. "I don't want this to affect the kids." Robert's gaze hardened. "It already did," he said. "Long before you showed up." David nodded. That afternoon, the foundation office opened its doors for the first time. It wasn't much, 2 rented rooms above a closed-down bakery, mismatched desks, donated chairs, but people came anyway. Word had spread faster than David expected. A woman with a toddler on her hip. A former mill worker with eviction papers folded so thin they looked worn through. An elderly man who didn't sit down, just stood and waited his turn like he didn't trust chairs anymore. Annie came with him after school. "You don't have to stay," David told her. "I want to see," she replied. She sat in the corner with a book, watching, listening. When a woman started crying halfway through, explaining her situation, Annie looked up sharply. David passed her a box of tissues without comment. The woman took one, nodded, and kept talking. Afterward, Annie whispered, "You didn't tell her it would be okay." "No," David said. "I told her we'd help." Annie nodded slowly. "That's better." As the room emptied, a man David didn't recognize lingered by the door. "You the billionaire?" the man asked flatly. "Not anymore," David replied. The man snorted. "Figures." He glanced at Annie. "You got kids now?" David felt the question land wrong. "I have responsibility," he said evenly. The man stared at him for a long moment. "You think you're different." "I think I'm accountable," David replied. The man shook his head. "We'll see." He left without another word. That night, Annie was quiet. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked as David washed dishes. "No," he replied immediately. "You looked tired when that man talked to you." David considered his answer. "Some people don't want things to change," he said. "Because change makes them uncomfortable." Annie hugged her knees. "Like when teachers get mad when kids ask questions?" "Yes," David said. "Exactly like that." She stared at the wall. "Then I'm going to keep asking." David smiled. "I was hoping you would." Later, after Eli was asleep and Robert had gone to bed, David sat alone with the letter on the table. He unfolded it again, read it slowly. "Walk away while you still can." He thought of Annie counting breaths in a hospital room, of Eli drawing maps of places he hadn't yet been allowed to go, of Robert coughing metal dust into his sleeve for 30 years so other men could talk about progress. David took the letter, tore it carefully into small pieces, and dropped them into the trash. Outside, sirens passed and faded. Somewhere, someone was already drafting another warning, another strategy, another way to remind him of what he had lost. David leaned back in his chair. Let them come, he thought. This time, he wasn't standing alone. The first time Annie spoke at the foundation office, no one noticed at first. She was sitting near the window, legs tucked beneath her chair, watching the room fill the way she always did, counting people, exits, voices. David was in the back with a volunteer, reviewing intake forms, when a man near the front raised his voice. "They promised retraining," the man said, anger cracking through exhaustion. "They promised jobs. All we got were pamphlets." A few heads nodded. Someone muttered agreement. The room tightened. David stepped forward, ready to respond, but Annie stood up before he could. Her chair scraped softly against the floor. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice small but steady. "Can I say something?" The man turned, surprised. So did everyone else. David froze. Annie swallowed, then went on. "My dad worked at the factory too. He got sick. We didn't get pamphlets. We got notices on our door." The room went very quiet. "I don't know about retraining," she continued. "I don't know about plans, but I know what it feels like when grown-ups decide things without looking at who gets hurt." The man stared at her, his anger faltering. Annie's hands trembled slightly. But she didn't sit down. "Mr. David didn't fix everything," she said. "But he stayed. That matters." She sat back down. No one clapped. No one spoke. Then the man nodded once and lowered his voice. "All right," he said. "Let's talk about what staying looks like." Later, when the office was empty again, David knelt in front of Annie. "You didn't have to do that," he said gently. She shrugged. They weren't listening. David smiled. "They were." She looked up at him. "Was that okay?" "It was more than okay," he replied. "It was brave." She frowned slightly. "I wasn't brave. I was just tired of being quiet." David felt something shift again, deep and irreversible. That evening, the phone rang after dinner. David listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Annie watched him from the table. "Bad call?" "Yes," David said when he hung up. "Someone filed a complaint. Says the foundation is interfering with redevelopment permits." "What does that mean?" Eli asked. "It means they want us gone," Annie said flatly. David looked at her. "How did you—" "They always do," she replied. Robert coughed softly from the doorway. "She's not wrong. Ever." The next week was harder. Funding offers were delayed. Permits stalled. A reporter published an article questioning David's motives, using words like savior complex and performative accountability. David read it once and put it down. Annie found it later. "They don't know you," she said. David didn't answer. "Do they?" she pressed. He sighed. "They know a version of me. Is it the wrong one?" "Yes," she nodded. "Then that's their problem." At school, things weren't as simple. Annie came home one afternoon with her backpack held too tightly. Her mouth set in a way David was learning to recognize. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," she said quickly. David waited. "Someone said I only get help because you feel guilty," she muttered. David felt heat rise in his chest. "Who said that?" "It doesn't matter," Annie replied. "I told them they were wrong." "What did they say then?" "They laughed." David knelt. "Did it make you feel small?" Annie hesitated, then nodded. David took a breath. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "You didn't earn help because of me. I earned responsibility because of you." She looked up, eyes wet but fierce. "That's not how they see it. That's not how truth works," David replied. "Truth doesn't change just because someone doesn't like it." She wiped her face with her sleeve. "I don't want to be your reason anymore." David felt the weight of that. "You're not," he said carefully. "You're my reminder. I have an honest odor." "Of what?" "Of who I was," he said, "and who I refused to be again." The next day, the foundation office was inspected. Clipboards, badges, polite suspicion. David answered every question. He handed over every document. He didn't argue. Annie watched from the corner, silent. After they left, she asked, "Are we in trouble?" "Yes," David said. "And no," she frowned. "That doesn't make sense. It means they're trying to slow us down," he explained. "But they haven't found a reason to stop us." She nodded. Yet, that night, David found Annie awake, sitting at the table with a blank piece of paper. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Writing," she said. "You don't have homework." "I know." He leaned closer. "What are you writing?" She hesitated, then slid the paper toward him. It was a list, things that shouldn't happen to kids: evictions, hungry nights, sick parents with no doctors, being invisible. David stared at it. "I want to help," Annie said quietly. "Not just talk." David swallowed. "You already are." She shook her head. "I want it to be real." He nodded slowly. "Then it will be." Outside, the city shifted and pressed and resisted, the way it always did when something new tried to take root. Inside, a child who had learned too early how fragile the world could be was deciding to push back anyway. David watched her, knowing the road ahead would be harder because of this moment, and also knowing he wouldn't trade it for anything. The first public hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. David knew it wasn't an accident. Tuesday meant working people would have to choose between showing up and keeping their jobs. It meant parents scrambling for childcare, elderly residents navigating buses that didn't run on time. It meant the room would look emptier than it should, and emptiness could be framed as apathy. Annie knew it too. "They picked a bad day on purpose," she said, sitting on the edge of the couch, shoes already on. "Yes," David replied, tying his own. "They did. Are we still going?" David looked at her. "Absolutely." Robert stayed home with Eli, who was still recovering from a cold. Annie insisted on coming. "I need to see," she said. "They always decide things where kids aren't allowed." The city hall building was colder than the foundation office, all stone and echo, designed to remind people who had power and who was borrowing it. Annie held herself straight as they walked in, her small hand brushing David's coat once, then falling back to her side. The room was half full, developers in suits, city officials behind a raised desk. A few familiar faces from the neighborhood scattered among them, sitting quietly, as if unsure they belonged there. David signed in. Annie scanned the room. "They're already tired," she whispered. David followed her gaze, people leaning back, folded arms, eyes drifting toward clocks. The hearing began with formalities, language that smoothed sharp edges into phrases like economic revitalization and long-term growth. Charts were displayed, numbers discussed. When it was David's turn, he stood. He didn't bring slides. He spoke plainly. This project was approved without a full accounting of its human cost, he said. That wasn't an oversight. That was a choice. A murmur rippled through the room. I'm not here to stop development, David continued. I'm here to insist that progress includes the people already standing on the land you want to build on. A council member leaned forward. Mr. Cole, with all due respect, this process has been vetted. David nodded. By people who don't live there. Annie watched the faces change. Some stiffened, some narrowed. You're asking us to delay, another official said. I'm asking you to listen, David replied. There's a difference. When the floor was open to public comment, silence followed. Then Annie stood. David's heart skipped. She hadn't told him she planned to speak. I live behind the factory, she said, her voice clear, carrying farther than she expected. Or, I did. Heads turned. My dad worked there. He got sick. We got eviction notices. No one asked us what would happen. A council member frowned. Sweetheart. This process. Annie didn't stop. I'm not here to yell, she said. I'm here because when grown-ups decide things without kids still have to live with them. The room was very still now. I go to school now, Annie continued. I'm learning about maps, about how places are made. I think places should remember who they're made of. She sat down. No applause. Just silence that felt different than before. Afterward, in the hallway, a man approached David. You're using a child to make a point, he said sharply. David met his gaze. She made her own, the man scoffed. This isn't going to end well for you. David nodded. I know. On the steps outside, Annie exhaled hard. My legs were shaking. You did well, David said. I wasn't trying to, she replied. I just didn't want them to pretend we're not real. David looked at her, feeling the familiar mix of pride and fear. That afternoon, the article came out. Not kind. Not subtle. Questions about exploitation, about motives, about whether David Cole had crossed from accountability into recklessness. Annie read it over his shoulder. They're saying you're using me, she said. David swallowed. I'm sorry. She shook her head. They don't get to decide that. He looked at her. Does it bother you? She thought about it. It bothers me that they think kids don't know when they're being used. Tellin'. David nodded slowly. You're right. That night, Robert listened as David described the hearing. She spoke? Robert asked. Yes. Robert smiled faintly. That's my girl. Annie glanced at him. I was scared. Courage isn't not being scared, Robert said. It's deciding something matters more. Later, as the apartment settled into quiet, David sat with Annie at the table. You don't have to do this, he said softly. Any of it. Annie traced the edge of the paper with her finger. If I stop, they'll keep doing it. David didn't argue. Outside, the city council chambers emptied. Papers were filed. Decisions deferred. No victory declared. But something had shifted. A record had been made. A voice had been heard. And somewhere between stone walls and folding chairs, a line had been crossed quietly, irrevocably. David looked at Annie, 6 years old and already carrying more truth than most rooms could hold. Whatever came next, he knew this much. There was no going back. The injunction came quietly. No press conference, no announcement. Just a court document filed late on a Friday afternoon, dense with language most people wouldn't read unless it affected their rent, their job, or their sleep. Construction on the redevelopment site was temporarily suspended pending further review. David read it twice to be sure. Annie watched his face. Is that good? It's a pause, he said carefully. Not a win, she nodded. Pauses matter. They do, David thought. Sometimes they're the only space where truth can breathe. The pause didn't last long. By Monday morning, calls were coming in from investors, former partners, board members who hadn't spoken to David in years but suddenly remembered his number. You're destabilizing confidence, one voice warned. This is getting personal, another said. David listened. He thanked them for their concern. He said very little else. At the foundation office, the mood shifted. People spoke in lower voices. Volunteers double-checked locks. A donated coffee maker went missing overnight, probably taken by someone who needed it more than they did. But the absence still felt symbolic. Annie noticed. Everyone's walking like the floor might break, she said. David glanced around. Fear travels fast. Does it win? She asked. Sometimes, he admitted. Only if people let it. That afternoon, a man showed up unannounced. Mid-50s, clean coat, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm here to see David Cole, he told the volunteer. David stepped forward. That's me. The man extended his hand. Marcus Hale, development liaison. David didn't take the hand right away. For whom? Marcus smiled thinly. You already know. They sat across from each other at the small conference table. Annie sat nearby with a book she wasn't reading. We can end this, Marcus said, folding his hands. Quietly, David raised an eyebrow. By doing what? By returning to the table, Marcus replied. The real one. David leaned back. This is the real one, Marcus chuckled. No, this is a detour. One that costs you reputation, influence, protection. Annie looked up. Protection from what? Marcus glanced at her, surprised. From consequences. David's voice hardened. You mean accountability? Marcus sighed. You've made your point. People listened. Now it's time to step aside. And the families? David asked. The ones displaced? Marcus spread his hands. Unfortunate, but inevitable. Annie closed her book. That's what people say when they don't have to move. Marcus looked at her, irritation flashing. This is adult business. Annie met his gaze. Adults made the mess. Silence stretched. Marcus stood. Think carefully, he said to David. Pauses don't last forever. After he left, the room felt smaller. You okay? David asked Annie. She nodded. He was trying to scare you. Yes. 200 batter. Did it work? David thought about it. No. That night, Robert came by. You're poking a bear, he said bluntly. I know, David replied. Robert looked at Annie. You scared the wrong people. Annie shrugged. They scared us first. Robert smiled, then coughed hard, the sound deep and metallic. David waited until the fit passed. You should be resting. Robert waved him off. I've been resting my whole life. Didn't help. Later, Annie sat beside Robert on the couch. Do you think my dad would be mad? She asked suddenly. Robert stilled. About what? About all this, she said. About me talking, about making trouble. Robert considered. Your father spent his life being quiet so other people could be loud, he said. I think he'd be proud you learned something different. Annie swallowed. Sometimes I feel like I'm breaking something. Robert shook his head. You're breaking silence. Big difference. The next morning, the vandalism happened. Spray paint across the foundation door. A slur. A warning. David stood staring at it, jaw tight. Annie didn't look away. They want us to stop, she said. Yes. Are we going to? David turned to her. No. A reporter showed up before noon. Do you think this proves your critics right? She asked, microphone hovering. That standing up invites backlash? David replied. Yes, it always has. And the child? The reporter pressed. Do you regret involving her? David didn't hesitate. I regret a world where telling the truth is considered dangerous. Annie watched from behind him, shoulders squared. That afternoon, neighbors came by. One brought a bucket of water. Another offered paint. Someone taped over the words before Annie could read them too closely. A woman Annie recognized from the shelter squeezed her hand. You did good, she said quietly. Annie nodded, throat tight. As the door was repainted, David realized something he hadn't expected. They weren't alone anymore. That night, Annie lay awake. David, she whispered. Yes, if they win, will it mean we were wrong? David stared at the ceiling. No, he said softly. It will only mean they were louder. She turned toward him. Then we just have to keep being real. David smiled in the dark. Exactly. Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent and relentless. But somewhere behind a freshly painted door, a child who had once picked through plastic bottles to survive was learning a different kind of endurance. And David knew what came next would cost more than money. It would cost comfort. It would cost safety. But it would also change something that could not be undone. The whistleblower came forward on a Thursday night. Not through the foundation, not through the media, through Annie. She was doing homework at the kitchen table when the knock came, 3 short taps, hesitant, like the person on the other side might change their mind mid-motion. David checked the hallway first, then opened the door. The man standing there looked out of place and exactly where he belonged at the same time. Early 40s. Work boots worn thin, a jacket that still smelled faintly of oil and cold steel. "I heard this was where people listened," he said. David studied him for a beat, then stepped aside. "Come in." The man's eyes flicked to Annie, then away. "I don't want trouble for the kid." Annie set her pencil down. "I'm not a kid like that," she said calmly. "You can talk." The man swallowed. "Name's Luis," he said. "I worked compliance at the steel plant. Before it shut down." David's posture shifted. "Compliance doesn't usually knock on doors at night." Luis gave a tired smile. "That's because compliance usually gets ignored." He sat, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "They knew," he said. "About the soil, about the runoff, about the sickness reports. They knew before the closure was announced." David felt his pulse slow, sharpen. "Who is they?" "Your former board," Luis replied. "And the city inspectors they leaned on." Annie's voice was soft. "Is that why my dad got sick?" Luis closed his eyes. "Yes." The word landed heavy. "They buried the reports," Luis continued. "Reclassified exposure levels. When the redevelopment deal came through, it was easier to shut the place down and call it progress than admit fault." David leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Luis nodded. "Copies, emails, internal memos. I kept them because I couldn't sleep." Annie hugged her arms. "Will it help?" Luis looked at her. "It'll hurt first. Will good do lie as for?" David exhaled. "It always does." They didn't sleep much that night. By morning, David had called his legal team new ones, not tied to his old empire. By noon, the documents were scanned, secured, backed up in places Luis didn't know how to pronounce. Annie watched it all quietly. "You okay?" David asked her during a pause. She nodded. "It hurts where it already hurt," she said. "That means it's real." The story broke 2 days later, not as a headline, as an investigation. Independent journalists. Verified documents. Timelines that refused to stay buried. The city responded with statements, carefully worded, non-committal. The developers went silent. At school, Annie was pulled aside by the counselor. "Some adults are concerned," the woman said gently, "about the pressure you're under." Annie folded her hands. "Are they concerned about kids who get sick?" The counselor hesitated. "That's a different issue." Annie shook her head. "It's the same one." 2 days ago. That afternoon, protesters gathered outside City Hall. Not many, but enough. Robert watched the footage on a borrowed tablet, coughing softly. "About time," he muttered. That night, David received another call. This one was calm, almost polite. "You're forcing our hand," the voice said. David recognized it immediately. "You always had one." "Step back," the voice continued. "Let the investigation proceed quietly." "Quietly benefits you," David replied. "Loudly benefits no one," the voice countered. David thought of Annie sitting at the table, listing things that shouldn't happen to kids. "It benefits the truth," he said. The line went dead. 2 days later, Luis disappeared. Not missing, just gone. His apartment empty. His phone disconnected. No forwarding address. Annie noticed David staring at the screen. "They scared him," she said. "Yes," David replied. "Is he okay?" "I don't know." She took a breath. "Then we have to keep going." David looked at her. "That might put you in danger." Annie met his eyes. "I was in danger before you met me." The city scheduled a second hearing. This one on a Saturday. The room was full. Workers, parents, old men with hands that shook not from age, but from years of holding heavy things. Annie didn't speak this time. She didn't have to. Luis's documents spoke for her. So did the charts no one had wanted to show before. The dates that lined up too perfectly. The illnesses that clustered too tightly. A council member cleared his throat. "We will be launching a formal inquiry." Too late, Annie thought. But still necessary. Outside, a woman Annie didn't know pressed a folded photo into her hand. "My son," the woman said. "He worked there too." Annie held the picture carefully. "I'm sorry." The woman shook her head. "Thank you." That night, David sat with Annie on the floor, backs against the couch. "Sometimes," Annie said, "I wish I didn't know all this." David nodded. "Me too. But then," she continued, "I think about how quiet it was before. And that was worse." David smiled sadly. Yes, it was. Outside, the city buzzed with arguments and denials and the slow grinding sound of accountability beginning to turn. Inside, a child who had once been invisible was now impossible to ignore, and David knew the next chapter wouldn't be about exposure. It would be about consequences. Consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came in fragments. A resignation announced for personal reasons. A lawsuit quietly filed, then amended. A city official suddenly unavailable for comment. Each piece on its own looked small. Together, they formed a pattern no one could pretend not to see. David watched it unfold from a distance he hadn't known existed until now. He no longer took meetings in glass towers or spoke through intermediaries trained to soften language. He sat at a scarred wooden desk above a closed bakery and listened to people who had never once been asked for their version of events. Annie listened too. She had started carrying a small notebook again, not for lists this time, but for names, people she met, stories she didn't want to forget. She didn't write much about herself. One afternoon, she asked David, "Do you think they'll say sorry?" He considered the question. "Some will," he said. "Most won't know how." "Thanks for watching. Does that mean it doesn't count?" "It still counts," David replied. "It just doesn't heal everything." At school, things shifted in small ways. The laughter stopped first, then the whispers. A teacher asked Annie if she wanted to help with a civics project. Another student asked what the factory used to make. Annie answered calmly, without anger, without apology. Eli drew pictures again, not maps this time, but people. Stick figures at first, then faces. One he labeled Dad, one Annie, one David. He hesitated over the last, then added a fourth. "Who's that?" David asked. Eli shrugged. "The man who doesn't get to come back." David nodded. The hearing's final report was released on a gray Monday morning. Negligence, suppression of data, regulatory failure. The words were heavy, official, insufficient. Annie read them slowly. "They used a lot of words," she said. "None of them say my dad's name." David felt that familiar ache. "No," he said. "They rarely do." The city announced restitution funds, health screenings, a memorial to be discussed. Annie looked up from the paper. "Discussed isn't the same as built." "No," David agreed. "But it's how they avoid admitting they waited too long." That evening, Robert sat quietly with the report folded in his lap. "They're finally saying what we knew," he said. "Yes," Robert coughed, then smiled faintly. "Your father would have liked this part," he said to Annie, the truth catching up. "Aight." Annie leaned against him. "I wish he was here." "So do I," Robert replied. 2 weeks later, the call came, the former board chair. David hadn't heard his voice in over a year. "We need to talk," the man said. David's response was calm. "About what?" "About moving forward." David glanced at Annie, who was pretending not to listen. "You can talk," he said. "I'm done moving for you." Silence crackled on the line. Then the chair cleared his throat. "There will be settlements," he said. "Quiet ones. You'll be compensated." "For what?" David asked. "For your losses." David laughed softly, without humor. "You don't get to define those." He hung up. That night, Annie sat on the floor, sorting her notebook. "I don't want to forget how it felt," she said suddenly. David sat beside her. "Which part?" "All of it," she replied. "The bad. The part where no one looked at us. And the part where they finally did." David nodded. "Memory is a kind of justice." She smiled slightly. "Then I'm going to be good at it." The foundation office moved again, this time into a larger space. Still modest. Still imperfect, but with room for people to sit without bumping elbows, and windows that let the light stay longer in the afternoon. On the first day, Annie helped tape a hand-lettered sign to the wall. "Listen first." A woman stopped to read it. "That's new," she said. Annie shrugged. It shouldn't be. At the end of the month, the city held a ceremony. A plaque, speeches, apologies shaped to sound careful. David didn't attend. Annie chose to go. She stood quietly at the edge, holding Eli's hand, listening as names were read. Her father's name was among them, spoken aloud for the first time in a place that mattered. She didn't cry. Later, she told David, "I didn't want them to think that was the end." David understood. That night, after Eli was asleep, Annie asked, "What happens now?" David leaned back, tired in a way that felt earned. "Now," he said, "we keep going without being angry all the time." She nodded. "Anger helped us start." "Yes," he said, "but it can't build everything." She thought about that. "I think I want to help kids learn how to talk to grown-ups who don't listen." David smiled. "That might be the hardest work of all." Annie smiled back. "Then it's probably important." Outside, the city moved forward, slower now, aware of the eyes on it. Inside, a child who had once survived by scavenging learned something quieter and stronger. That justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it stays. The first quiet morning felt unfamiliar. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains and rested on the kitchen floor, soft and ordinary, as if nothing in the world were waiting to be decided. David stood at the sink, hands wrapped around a mug he had forgotten to drink from, listening to the slow rhythm of the apartment waking up. Annie was already dressed, not rushed, not braced for something to go wrong, just dressed. She sat at the table, carefully tying and untying the same shoelace, thinking. "You don't have to come with me today," David said gently. "It's just paperwork." Annie looked up. "I know." She paused. "But I want to walk you there." David nodded. "All right." They took the long route, past the old factory gates now fenced off. Silent, waiting for something that had not yet earned the right to exist. Annie slowed there. "Just for a moment. They still haven't decided what to build," she said. "No," David replied. "And they won't. Not without asking this time." She nodded, satisfied. At the foundation office, people were already waiting. Not desperate, not afraid, just present. A woman with a grocery list folded into her coat pocket. A man with paint on his hands who had come straight from work. Two teenagers sitting side by side, pretending not to be nervous. Annie stood back and watched. This was what she noticed first. No one was whispering. David caught her eye. She gave him a small nod. Later, after the last form was signed and the last question answered, David closed the office door and leaned against it, suddenly tired. Annie sat on the windowsill, swinging her legs. "Is it done now?" she asked. David considered the word. "This part is," he said. She smiled. "Good. I don't like endings that pretend everything's fixed." He laughed softly. "Neither do I." That afternoon, they visited the small park near the old neighborhood. It wasn't much. A cracked basketball court, a bench with peeling paint, but it was where Annie used to sit with her brother, counting cars and imagining where they might be going. Eli ran ahead, chasing pigeons with reckless joy. Annie watched him, her face calm. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. David turned to her. "Do you want to?" She shook her head. "No, I think, if we leave, it's like saying this place doesn't matter anymore." David followed her gaze across the street, to the empty storefronts, the quiet resilience that still lived there. "Places don't stop mattering just because they change," he said. "They matter because people remember them." Annie nodded. "Then I want to remember right." That evening, Robert came by. He looked thinner, weaker, but his eyes were clear. "You did good," he said to Annie, settling into the chair with care. She shrugged. "We did." Robert smiled. "That's how it works." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. "This was your father's," he said, handing it to her. "He gave it to me years ago. Said you might want it someday." Annie hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, old, soft at the edges. It was a list, things to fix when I have time. The roof, the truck, the world. If they let me. Annie pressed the paper to her chest, breathing in slowly. "They didn't let him," she said. "No," Robert replied, "but you're doing it anyway." Later that night, Annie sat alone at the table, her notebook open. She didn't write lists anymore. She wrote stories, not big ones, Not neat ones. Just moments. A man who finally spoke up. A woman who didn't apologize for being angry. A city that listened, late, but not too late. David watched from the doorway, saying nothing. He had learned when silence mattered. Before bed, Annie paused. David? Yes? When I grow up? I don't want to be important. David raised an eyebrow. No, I want to be useful, she said. Important people get protected. Useful people make room. David felt something steady settle in his chest. That's a good ambition. She smiled. I thought so. Outside, the city breathed. It was still imperfect, still uneven, still capable of harm. But somewhere within it, a line had been drawn not in ink or law alone, but in memory. A line that said, we were here. We were seen. We mattered. David turned off the light. In the quiet that followed, there was no triumph, only something better. A future that would have to be earned, again and again. And a child who knew, without being told, that justice didn't arrive as a gift. It arrived when someone refused to look away. The story reminds us that justice rarely begins with power or wealth, it begins with seeing. When those who have the means finally look at the lives their decisions affect, responsibility replaces comfort. True progress is not measured by buildings or profits, but by whether the most vulnerable are protected and heard. The courage of a child to speak, and the humility of an adult to listen, reveal a quiet truth. Silence sustains injustice, but conscience once awakened demands action. In the end, the story teaches that dignity is restored not by saving others from above, but by standing beside them and refusing to look away. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.